Hello, and welcome to the ECD Instincts and Habits lecture. Instincts and Habits is at the baseline of all East Coast divers teaching philosophy. It's a philosophy that has its roots all the way back into the original days of instruction at the Ed Brawley School out of California. Over the years, diving instruction has been reduced, cut down, and watered down to allow as many people to come through certification as possible and to capitalize on certification numbers. Unfortunately, this has led to a 90% attrition rate within the diving industry, meaning that divers are getting certified and then not remaining in the sport due to their own discomfort in the water. Instincts and Habits is a baseline philosophy that addresses instincts that we are born with as a land mammal and brings up training techniques to allow us to integrate good in-water habits with our students, ensuring that they are comfortable and confident in the water and become lifetime divers. So let's talk about instincts and habits. What is instincts and habits? Well, it is the core philosophy behind all ECD training, whether it be open water, advanced, or even technical. Instincts and habits has a place within our instruction. So what is the baseline definition? Well, instincts are a base level behavior that we are born with. Think fight or flight. Habits are behaviors that are repeated with consistency and discipline to create muscle memory and second nature reactions. So the three instincts that we need to address as dive professionals are the scuffle, the flee, and the breath hold. As individuals, as animals, we have two thought processes. We have automatic and we have resolve. Automatic behaviors are behaviors that are done typically in heightened states of adrenaline. Again, think back to fight or flight. Resolve is our thought processes when we can think logically and have time to analyze a scenario and a situation. If we allow ourselves to remain on automatic behavior for too long, inevitably, this leads to panic, and panic leads to accidents in the water. So our goal is to have good, solid habits that will allow us in an automatic mind state to move into a resolve mind state as efficiently as possible. So we're going to address the three instincts that we are born with as land mammals and talk about each of the skills that we can integrate into our student diver training that will help train those out and form good habits. So let's talk about the scuffle. What is the scuffle? The scuffle is a subconscious movement of the hands and arms at the surface or underwater. Think very basic sculling technique or treading water. This instinct is inherent in us to try to keep the airway and our heavy head above the surface of the water. It is not efficient and it is really just there so that we can last long enough in the water to move towards a shoreline or land base. So what are the habits as a professional that we want to make sure that we are training in order to overcome this instinct of the scuffle? Well, the first is snorkel use. A lot of people do not appreciate the benefit to having a snorkel in the water. And that's largely due to the fact that they've never been taught to use a snorkel properly. While a very simple piece of equipment, the snorkel is actually an incredibly important part because it allows us to convert our breathing hole from the front of our face to the back of our head. Our head is incredibly heavy, and trying to maintain our head above the surface of the water means that that weight of that head is pressing down in a vertical nature, so our body is now sinking. Hence that scuffling of our hands and our arms in order to try to stay up. By placing a snorkel on our equipment and using that snorkel to allow our face to be in the water, we now displace that weight of the head into the water and allow our bodies to float up behind us. Now, using the snorkel comes with some technique. Most people will just breathe from a snorkel in a traditional fashion, the same as you're breathing right now here on the surface. The problem with that is that there are two things within the snorkel that can potentially cause problems to our breathing. The first is fairly obvious, and that is water. Water entering the snorkel can create us to choke, and that can create discomfort and anxiety in the water. The second, which is a little less obvious, is carbon dioxide. CO2 is a waste product that is exhaled on every breath. When we use a snorkel, it creates a dead air space that is an extension of our typical respiratory system. And by exhaling and inhaling at a normal pattern, what ends up happening is we end up rebreathing that CO2 and increasing our absorbed and stored carbon dioxide level in our body. Now, CO2 is 80% of our urge to breathe. So when we continue to breathe through a snorkel in a normal fashion, we increase that level of CO2 that we're retaining, which has an effect of increasing our urge to breathe. It also elevates the heart rate and will eventually lead to hyperventilation and then panic. So what is the best remedy in order to make sure that we are not taking on water or rebreathing this potentially harmful gas? The methodology behind breathing of the snorkel is known as snorkel popping, and it is a rhythmic breathing cycle that consists of a short, sharp pop, almost like saying the number 2 in a forceful fashion through the snorkel. That is then followed by a slow and cautious inhalation. You can use your tongue behind the roof of your teeth in order to create a secondary splash guard to prevent water from hitting the back of the throat. In the event that the snorkel wasn't fully cleared on your first pop, you can breathe over your tongue and continue to pop that snorkel and breathe over the tongue until it's clear. Once we know that the snorkel is clear of water and CO2 from that forceful exhalation, we can take a full breath and then hold. We're going to hold our breath for 2 to 3 seconds with that snorkel in our mouth. And then when we are ready, we can then lift our head, ensuring that the top of the snorkel is clear of the surface of the water, and re-pop that snorkel to take our next breath. This is how we should always breathe from the snorkel. It will ensure that we get a clean breath every time we want it. By holding our breath in between breaths, those full lungs also provide positive buoyancy. That allows us to float at the surface and is an integral thing to teach a student because it provides comfort and confidence while they're at the surface. Whether their gear is functioning or not, if a student or a diver has a mask on and a snorkel in, and they know how to pop the snorkel, they can indeed float endlessly, which means that whether they are in 2-foot seas or 10-foot seas, it doesn't matter. They get to choose to be at the surface. They either float or they sink, but that is their decision. It is not left to fate or a roll of the dice. By integrating strong snorkel usage techniques, you are going to create a confident diver on the surface. Taking the time to make this habit happen is time consuming. You have to remind the students throughout the entirety of their pool training. Every time they're on their surface, they should have their snorkel in instead their regulator, and they should be popping that snorkel. They are not going to commit to this habit unless you, as the professional, reinforce it at every opportunity. When we are on the surface, another way to deal with sculling is to teach our students how to appropriately move their fins to hold position. They're going to want to kick their feet in a bicycle kicking fashion. By teaching an appropriate scull where we are moving the fins in and out in a slightly frog kick pattern, leaning back into the backplate and wing or BC with their snorkel in, will allow the students to maintain a head up position. Showing the students this particular technique early on in their training will make your life as an instructor significantly easier, because instead of them struggling on the surface when you are trying to brief them, they will have a much better ability to listen and comprehend to the information that you are conveying, because they are not fighting to stay up. Underwater, that scuffling can become problematic because it's going to throw the diver off of their position. The way to handle this with your students is to teach them to rely on proper breath control. By breathing in, out, breathing on the top of their lungs or the bottom of their lungs, they can control their position. That scuffling underwater is a land mammal reaction to a loss of balance. If they're leaning on one side or the other and they begin to quote unquote fall in the water, they are going to want to try to scuffle their hands or use their hands to balance. It is up to us to teach them that that balancing is only a surface reaction, and that the actual way to control our position in the water is to use our breath. If we are lifting, we exhale. If we are sinking, we inhale. Keep the arms out in front, and we can bring their hands together if they continue to scuffle. Along the lines of that scuffling, while remaining in balance, proper trim position and good weighting is also going to have a very large impact. If the weighting on the student is such that it is off kilter and you have weight slightly more on one side than the other, you are going to inherently force that student to scuffle in order to maintain balance. The other thing that will cause a student to scuffle while underwater is ill-fitting webbing or bad-fitting BCs. If the crotch strap is not fitted properly, if that webbing is too wide on the waist strap, that equipment is going to move back and forth in the water, and the diver and student is going to fight that reaction as they move. It is important to take the time to properly size that webbing of the diver and the student. If you don't make those adjustments, you are going to have a harder time teaching, and the student is going to have a harder time feeling comfortable. Take a moment to address and adjust ill-fitting equipment whenever it is noticed in the water. The last and final part about proper trim position and scuffling is cylinder position. If the cylinder is too high up on the diver, it is going to cause them to want to lift their front, because the first stage will be hitting them back in the head, so they will be unable to lift their head to a position where they can see forwards in proper trim. A lot of the time, especially with those with short torsos, it is imperative that that cylinder gets moved lower down the back. The base of the cylinder should be resting between the butt cheeks. It should sit center to the shoulder blades, so that that first stage, when the neck is lifted and the face looking forwards, is sitting in the crux of the neck between the shoulders. If you integrate good snorkel techniques on the surface, if you integrate good finning techniques on the surface, if you talk about and reinforce proper reliance on breath control underwater and adjust trim and gear fitting, and pay attention to these from the very first pool session and reinforce them on every opportunity, you will find that your divers, by the end of your last pool session, will have a significantly more comfortable and controlled composure in the water. So let's talk about the next instinct, the flee. So what is the flee? Well, the flee is a tendency to lean into the fight or flight response. This is a reactionary. We are moving on to an automatic behavior, and we are going to immediately flee or run away to an area of which we are comfortable or where we feel there is safety. This could be bolting from depth to the surface, which we all know is bad, to something as simple as constantly removing a piece of equipment because we are not comfortable with it in position. So how do we resolve this? Well, the habits that we want to reinforce from the get-go. Starting in the pool, students will try to flee to the lane lines and the pool deck. It won't be super obvious. This won't be an aggressive flee. It will be subtle. They will reach back and they will hold onto the lane lines, or they will reach back and lean on the deck of the pool. We want to make sure that they are not making contact with the sides or the lane lines. We want them to bring their hands in, learn how to scull their feet properly to maintain position on the surface. Make sure that they can use that snorkel to keep their face in the water when they're resting after a long swim. The other skill we want to throw in addition for surface comfort, is oral inflation of the BC. Every time a student hits the surface, even if it's just momentary for a quick question, we want to make sure that we are having the student put 2 breaths of air in their BC via the oral inflation method. Students should bob to inflate their BC at every opportunity. This will become a habit by the end of your pool sessions. To establish positive buoyancy as a habit is going to make sure that in the event that that student hits the surface in the ocean and a problem arises, the first thing they do without a second's thought is to put 2 breaths in their BC and become positively buoyant. If you have established good snorkel techniques, they will then put their snorkel in and pop their snorkel. 90% of diving accidents happen at the surface. 90. If you can take the time to train in proper oral inflation on the surface and good snorkel habits, you will have just removed 90% chance of your diver and your student ever getting into a problem. Because even if they do have an issue, they can float and they can breathe. And if they don't feel like they're sinking and they don't feel like they can't breathe, then they are going to go from an automatic mindset to a resolve mindset very quickly. And on a resolve mindset, they can now problem solve. When it comes to the mask should be on the face. We don't care about the forehead and it getting washed off. We'll just sell them a new mask. We don't care if it's around the neck. That ends up just getting in the way. What we care about is that it's on the face. If they want to take it off their face, it's usually because of one of two things. One, it doesn't fit right, and that could just be poor fit, or the mask is too tight. Or two, they can't see. This is going to be evident because you're going to be able to see fogging in the mask. Either of these situations should be resolved at the first sign of discomfort. If a student's mask is fogging, take the time to defog it. If it continues to fog, even with correct defogging procedures, then it needs to be cleaned. Grab some toothpaste and clean it. If they continue to want to take the mask off, check the tightness of that strap. See if that mask is digging in. That mask is the window to their underwater world. If it is constantly flooding or if it is constantly fogged, that student's experience in the water is going to be drastically diminished. So taking the time so that they can see and be comfortable is going to reduce that flee instinct of removing that mask every time they're on the surface, and is going to remove that flee instinct of having to bolt to the surface because they are going to become more comfortable in their underwater environment because they won't feel nearly as claustrophobic. And the last thing that we want to train into our students when it comes down to the flee is stop, breathe, think, breathe, and react. As long as we're breathing, we're okay. We should establish this into our students from the get-go. If they're having a problem underwater, stop, breathe. As long as you can breathe, you're fine. This is going to largely help prevent bolts to the surface. We do not want our students seeking the surface as their point of comfort. We want them to trust their equipment. We need to get their breathing under control so they can get off of automatic behavior and onto resolve as fast as possible. If you pay attention to making contact to the side of the pool, teaching good finning techniques, again, to stay in a supported position, good snorkel habits, oral inflation every time they hit the surface, a clear mask of which they can see and is comfortable on their face, and that breathing is the response to anxiety underwater and not fleeing, you will have a student and a diver that is comfortable at depth and, more importantly, incredibly comfortable on the surface. Lastly, we have the breath hold. So what is the breath hold? Well, the breath hold is the tendency to hold one's breath under stressful conditions. If you take your hands, make a fist with one hand, and keep your open palm with the other. Raise them in front of you, place your fist into your palm, and push. Push. Now push harder. Now push harder. Now push harder. Now I want you to pay attention to what you're doing with your breath. More often than not, in this example, people will hold their breath. And that is the tendency under stress. So what do we do to help train this out? It's super simple. We train in the ooh exhale. The amount of times that I see this mentioned but not reinforced by instructors is more than I would like to actually admit. The ooh exhale allows us to control our breath on an exhalation. When a student takes that reg out, they are told that the number one rule of diving is to breathe continuously. Obviously, that means if they can't breathe in, they must breathe out. But if they just exhale, it's only going to be 3 or 4 seconds before they reach empty lungs. And empty lungs and tension on the diaphragm creates a very large urge to breathe response because the volume of the lungs is depreciated. So there is a stretch receptor in the diaphragm that creates an urge to breathe, coupled with a lower volume, so a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which again is 80% of our urge to breathe. So what we want to avoid is students getting to a point where they have exhaled all their air. You are very, very quickly going to see a bolt response coupled with a breath hold to the surface. So every time that student takes a reg out of their mouth, they should ooh exhale. Big breath in and ooh continuously. That passing of air over the vocal cords is going to help the student control the amount of air in which they can exhale at one time. Even under stressful conditions, if they're oohing harder, it normally puts tension on the vocal cords, restricting that exhalation even further, but still allowing for an exhalation. The additional benefit to that ooh exhale is that it creates an audible reminder. If the habit is to hear an ooh every time that regulator is out of their mouth, when they stop and hold their breath accidentally, that silence now becomes alarming. So to train in an ooh exhale into your students is going to enable them to recognize a breath hold under stressful conditions, especially when that regulator is out of their mouth. So, instincts and habits. A lot of people have a general idea of some of these concepts. However, as an ECD professional, it is imperative that you have in-depth understanding of all of these concepts, because they aren't something that we just bring up in one of the Zoom sessions. Instincts and habits is a way of diving. It is a philosophy of teaching. It is the pathway to create comfortable, confident, and competent divers in the water. And in order to succeed, You have to ingrain these habits and train out these negative instincts at every opportunity in the water. It is not going to be easy the first time that you do it. It will take time to become proficient. And much like your students and their repetition in order to create these habits within themselves, it's going to take time and repetition in your own teaching to make sure that these are habitual teaching habits that you are training into your students.